David led Douglas by the hand as they walked out of the station. It felt like the first time he had truly held the younger man's hand in such a public manner. David's hands were those of a surgeon, accustomed to the cold steel of a scalpel, his fingertips hardened by a thin layer of calluses. His fingers were long and well-defined, and his palms usually ran cool. Yet, wrapped tightly within Douglas's grip, they slowly began to warm. They were two tall men holding hands, walking down the street. It was a sight that naturally drew attention. Occasionally, passers-by would cast a glance their way, only to hurry past, their expressions fleeting. In the past, David would have found this unbearable. He had always detested being the center of attention, loathing the prying eyes of strangers. But tonight, he felt nothing of the sort. Douglas walked beside him, a head taller, and when David looked up, he could see the sharp, handsome profile of the young man's face. The surrounding crowd faded into a meaningless background blur. "Are you tired from the trip?" David asked, his voice low. "Did you get a chance to look around the city while you were there for the competition?" "Not really. I'm not too tired," Douglas replied, his thumb brushing over David's knuckles. "There wasn't much time left after the competition. I went to the observation tower that night, but I didn't go anywhere else." David nodded thoughtfully. "Let's get you something to eat then. It's your birthday today. I've booked a table." Douglas offered no objection and followed him to the underground parking garage. It was a Tuesday, and the drive back from the high-speed rail station wasn't terribly busy, but the restaurant David had chosen was in the city center's commercial district. It was a rooftop dining experience, and after a moment's thought, David decided he didn't want to fight through the evening traffic. The restaurant happened to be not far from his own home, so he made a decision. "I'll park at my place," David said. "We can walk to the restaurant from there." As they strolled toward the venue, Douglas asked, "Is George waiting for us at the restaurant?" He subconsciously assumed David wouldn't have forgotten to invite his nephew, George. Today was Douglas's birthday, and while he desperately wanted to spend it alone with David, he assumed that David, with his cautious personality, would drag George along to avoid any potential awkwardness. David buried his face slightly in his scarf and looked up blankly. "Huh? I didn't invite him." Douglas paused, his expression shifting into something subtle and unreadable. "Why not?" David looked at him with genuine confusion. "Didn't you say you wanted to spend it with me? If George came along, he'd be loud and chatting the whole time, and I wouldn't be able to." He stopped abruptly. The rest of that sentence hung in the air. "I wouldn't be able to be alone with you." Ever since picking Douglas up at the station, David's mind had been in turmoil. It felt as though 1,000 words were trapped in his chest, waiting to burst forth, yet if asked what exactly he wanted to say, he couldn't articulate it. He hadn't finished his sentence, but Douglas understood the implication immediately. He looked down and saw that David had buried half his face in the gray scarf. It was late autumn, and the evening air was biting. David's ears were dusted with a layer of red, though Douglas couldn't tell if it was from the cold or something else. For once, Douglas didn't tease him. He simply gazed at David with a dark, intense look for a moment, then tightened his grip on David's hand. "Let's go, then." 20 minutes later, they arrived. The restaurant admitted only a limited number of guests each evening. Every table was artfully partitioned by screens and lush plants, offering excellent privacy. David had reserved a table by the window, where the city lights glittered like a sea of diamonds below. It was a popular spot for couples, a fact David had noted in the reviews. He had hesitated, but booked it anyway. Now, sitting there, David clutched his water glass, finding himself unable to look Douglas in the eye. The waiter had taken his coat and scarf, leaving him in a crisp white shirt. The overhead lighting and the dim ambience made his skin look porcelain white, which only made the flush on his cheeks more obvious. Douglas found the sight amusing and couldn't help but whisper, "Are you planning to not look up all night?" David stiffened for a second, then reluctantly raised his head. But the moment he met Douglas's gaze, he felt scalded. Douglas was staring at him unblinkingly. The look was gentle, yet it hid a deep, predatory aggression, like a lion surveying its territory. Douglas's gaze traced down David's face, then back up to his eyes. "David," Douglas asked softly, his voice dropping an octave, "did you miss me these past few days?" "Did I?" David didn't know how to answer. He was a man who shied away from expressing emotion verbally. Even with his nephew George, he showed love through actions, rarely speaking it aloud. And this was Douglas. He said nothing, yet his silence spoke volumes. He looked at Douglas like a deer caught in headlights, innocent, confused, yet carrying an involuntary reliance. Douglas felt his heart heat up. He's torturing me, Douglas thought. How did I fall for a man who looks so cold and ascetic, but is actually so unintentionally seductive? David hadn't done anything. He was just sitting quietly. But his curled fingers, his clear eyes, his soft, reddened lips, everything screamed temptation. Douglas sighed silently, suppressing the restless pounding of his heart and the words rolling on the tip of his tongue. Not yet, he told himself. David is like a cautious clam. I've only just pried the shell open a crack. If I move too fast, I'll scare him shut forever. Douglas took a sip of ice water, letting the cold liquid cool his stomach and his nerves. For the rest of the meal, he was on his best behavior. His table manners were impeccable, and he refrained from any flirtatious remarks, sticking to safe topics like the competition. David gradually relaxed, though his mind remained preoccupied with the answer he needed to give Douglas later. Finally, dessert arrived. It was the birthday cake David had pre-ordered, a blue mirror glaze cake with candles forming the number 21 foot. 21, David said softly. This was Douglas's 21st birthday, and the first one David had spent with him. He had known this young man for less than a year, yet looking at the candles, he felt a strange illusion that they had known each other for half a lifetime. The tiny flames danced in the dim light. Make a wish, David said, smiling. Happy birthday. He knew Douglas usually spent birthdays with his family. If not for coming out of the closet, Douglas's family would have likely insisted on celebrating with him. But now, it was just the two of them. Douglas hadn't made a birthday wish in years. He considered it a deception for children. Ever since his parents stopped coming back for his birthdays when he was 8, he had lost interest in the ritual. But seeing David look at him so tenderly made him feel cherished. He closed his eyes and made the only wish that mattered. When he opened his eyes and blew out the candles, he looked across at David. David was watching him calmly, his eyes dark as a foggy night. For some reason, that calmness made Douglas uneasy. David slid a small, exquisite blue box across the table. This is your 21st birthday gift. Douglas looked at the blue box with its silver ribbon and frowned slightly. He sensed the expense of the gift. Slowly, with a heavy heart, he opened it. Nestled on blue velvet lay a rose gold watch. It was a Blancpain Villaret, a timepiece of considerable value. Beside it was a card. In elegant handwriting, it read, to Douglas on his 21st birthday. May your future be smooth sailing. It was a beautiful gift. Expensive, tasteful, flawless, and utterly heavy. Douglas took one look, then snapped the box shut and pushed it back toward David. This is too expensive, Douglas said, his voice dropping, the smile vanishing from his face. I don't think I have the standing to accept this. He owned watches far more expensive than this one. But what was his relationship with David? In what capacity was David giving him such a gift? The phrase on the card, may your future be smooth sailing stung his eyes. It was gentle, but to Douglas, it felt like a mockery. He was here to confess his love, to ask for David's heart, to spend his life with him. And David was wishing him smooth sailing, as if sending him off. David had reverted to the role of the benevolent elder, politely wishing him a bright future while signaling that he had no intention of being part of it. They were drawing a line again. The ambiguity and passion of the evening froze instantly. To David, he was just a junior, special, perhaps, but not enough to entrust with feelings. Douglas clenched his fist under the table until his knuckles turned white. He exhaled, forcing a smile that felt like it was bleeding. Let's treat this dinner as my gift. I won't accept the watch. David looked at him silently. The shyness and softness from moments ago seemed to vanish. He looked at Douglas as if looking at a dilemma he wasn't sure he should sever. He didn't argue. After a few seconds of silence, he picked up the box. If you don't want it, I won't force you. Let's go home. Outside the restaurant, David wrapped his scarf tightly around himself again. His pale face was buried in the cashmere, revealing only clear eyes and soft black hair. Walking beside Douglas, the age gap between them seemed to dissolve in the night. The walk back to David's house was suffocatingly silent. Douglas wasn't stupid. In fact, he was incredibly sharp. The moment he saw the watch and the card, he knew. David was going to reject him. The realization made it hard to breathe. Douglas looked down at the moonlight spilled on the pavement. It should have been a beautiful scene, but to him, the light looked like broken blades, cold and cruel. He didn't understand what had gone wrong. At the station, David had held his hand. At the restaurant, David had looked at him with shy tenderness. Why, after just one birthday wish, had everything changed? Douglas gritted his teeth, tasting iron. He stopped walking. He refused to take another step. They were near David's villa, just 2 minutes away. David would go home, and he would be shut out. David, Douglas called out, his voice rough. Don't you still owe me an answer? They had an agreement. David was supposed to give him a response. Rejection or acceptance, he needed to hear it. David stopped, but didn't turn around immediately. They stood one behind the other in the quiet alleyway. A few steps ahead was the gate to David's villa. On either side, branches of osmanthus trees stretched over the walls. The tiny golden flowers were nearing the end of their season, their scent faint and cold in the autumn wind. David took a deep breath, staring at the flowers. The first time Douglas had kissed him, it had been under an osmanthus tree. Now, they were back in a similar night. He turned around. He saw a thin layer of mist in Douglas's eyes that usually made his heart race. It looked as if a single touch would make tears fall. Yet Douglas's expression was fierce, looking at David as if he wanted to devour him whole. This man, since appearing in David's life, he had turned David's peaceful existence upside down. When David bought the watch, he had truly intended to reject Douglas. He was older, mature. If Douglas couldn't be rational, David had to be the cruel one. He knew Douglas's pride. If David spoke harsh words on his birthday, Douglas would leave and never look back. That's why he wrote the card. But as he wrote, "May your future be smooth sailing," he couldn't put the pen down. A hollow ache had spread through his chest, as if a piece of his heart had been gouged out. And now, Douglas stood before him. That missing piece of his heart slammed back into place. "I bought that gift intending to reject you," David said, his voice steady but quiet. "You and I, we shouldn't be lovers. You are 13 years younger than me. You are George's friend. You are a man. You are young and reckless. You have time. If you love me to death today and break up with me tomorrow, it's normal. No one would blame you because you have the capital to be capricious." David's eyes grew misty, the tip of his nose turning red. "But I don't. I can't afford to break my bones over this. At my age, talking about falling in love seems ridiculous." David bit his lip, leaving a deep mark. "Adults are selfish. We weigh the pros and cons. Being with you looks like a mistake from every angle." He spoke the truth. Every word was sincere. They were unmatched in age, gender, and family background. Their path forward was covered in thorns. "But," David let out a breath that shuddered. "Pushing you away is too hard." David stepped forward and gently rested his forehead against Douglas's shoulder. The moisture in his eyes clung to his eyelashes. "I should reject you," he whispered. "Maybe one day I'll regret this. I'll be in pain, thinking I shouldn't have made this choice. But if I separate from you now, I will regret it the very next second." He paused, then spoke the words hidden deepest in his heart. "I can't bear to let you go." David exhaled slowly against Douglas's coat. He had thought saying this would be difficult. For 33 years, he had followed the rules. But tonight, a madness in his blood demanded to be heard. And having said it, he felt a strange calm. He felt a hand grip his shoulder, tight enough to hurt. He looked up. Douglas was staring at him, eyes wide. "Is that true?" Douglas asked, his voice trembling. His blood, which had frozen at the mention of rejection, began to race again. "Say it clearly, David. What do you mean?" It wasn't enough. Douglas felt like a drowning man who had just breached the surface. He needed more. He needed David to cut his heart open and show him that he was inside. "Please," Douglas whispered, leaning his forehead against David's, their eyelashes almost brushing. "Tell me, do you really like me?" David gripped Douglas's sleeve, closed his eyes, and nodded with the resolve of a man burning his bridges. "I do." Of course he did. Why else would he become so unlike himself? He thought he would be a stagnant pool of water for the rest of his life, But Douglas was the bird that had landed on the surface, disturbing his peace forever. "I like you," David said. The confession shattered Douglas's restraint. "David," Douglas murmured. "My David." He pulled David into his arms, kissing his cold skin, his ears, and finally, his soft lips, demanding entry. They hid in the shadows of the alley wall. Douglas's tall frame completely enveloped David, shielding him from the world. David didn't refuse, indulging Douglas's advances. In the secluded alley, no one passed by. Only the osmanthus flowers witnessed them. "I really thought you were going to reject me," Douglas said between kisses, his voice broken. "I thought you were going to say I was just a moment of confusion for you." David was dizzy from the kiss. He wasn't used to such intensity. It was raw and clumsy, igniting a heat in his body despite the autumn chill. "This is fatal," David thought. "I can't take this much passion every day." After a long while, Douglas pulled back, gasping for air. He took David's hand and pressed it against his own cheek. "Say it again." "David, say you like me." David didn't hesitate this time. He touched the side of Douglas's face. "I like you. Since I've said it, I won't take it back. It's not a whim. I want to be with you. For a long time." He swallowed the words, forever. He didn't know if Douglas needed forever yet. But Douglas heard the unspoken promise. He looked at David, his heart trembling. His David. His Uncle David. Like a dream too good to be true. Initially, he just wanted a response. Now, David was giving him everything. It stirred a greed in him, a desire to lock David by his side eternally. "Don't let this be a dream," Douglas whispered, nuzzling David's hand. "If I wake up, I'll go crazy." David laughed softly. "Look at you, so dramatic." "I am," Douglas admitted, smiling. Douglas hugged David again, his chin resting on David's hair. "Actually, I spent all afternoon thinking about how to confess to you." David looked up, intrigued. Douglas loosened his hold slightly to look David in the eye. "I know I'm too young for you. Immature, unreliable. You're established, successful, and my life hasn't even really started. Even I feel like I don't deserve you." The words stuck in Douglas's throat. Just as David felt the weight of his age, Douglas felt the weight of his youth. He was 21, with nothing to his name but his family's money. How long would it take to stand shoulder to shoulder with David? David waited for the rest. Douglas rubbed his thumb over the corner of David's eye. "I just wanted to say, don't be afraid. You don't have to feel responsible for me. You like me, I like you, so let's try dating. But if one day you think I'm not good enough, you can throw me away. Consider it a probation period. If you're satisfied, then you can make me permanent." David frowned, scolding gently. Nonsense. Douglas knew David would react that way. David was loyal to a fault. Once he committed, he wouldn't easily let go. "I'm serious. You have the right to accept me and the right to reject me." "But," Douglas kissed David's fingertips, "if one day you feel I am good enough to entrust with all your feelings, then spend your life with me." He looked at David with eyes as bright as stars. David laughed, shaking his head. Such a child, talking about a lifetime so easily. He shouldn't believe it. But looking into Douglas's earnest eyes, he couldn't help but feel it was possible. "Okay," David nodded. "I agree to everything you said." He heard footsteps approaching. "Stop being clingy. Let's go." Douglas reluctantly let go, and they walked hand in hand toward the villa. Walking back, David felt a sense of unreality. He and Douglas were together. He glanced at Douglas, his gaze slightly dazed. "What is it?" Douglas asked. David tilted his head, his pale face bathed in the warm streetlights. "So, you count as my boyfriend now." He had prepared himself for a solitary life. Who knew that at 33, he would have a young male lover? Improper, he critiqued himself internally. Douglas felt a jolt of electricity at the word. "Yes. Starting today, I am your boyfriend." David brought his newly appointed boyfriend home. Douglas had visited many times, but this was the first time just the two of them were under this roof alone. Watching Douglas hang his coat by the door, David felt his face heat up. Dating for one day and already bringing him home, David thought. "I've really lost my mind." Douglas, however, seemed perfectly at home. He shuffled over in his slippers and wrapped his arms around David's waist from behind. "Stop it," David nudged him. "Go shower and sleep. You have class tomorrow, and I have work." "Where do I sleep?" Douglas rested his chin on David's shoulder. The guest room. It's all ready. Douglas pouted. First night of the relationship, and you're banishing the husband to the guest room? That's domestic abuse. He pressed David onto the sofa, looking down at him. You're really making me sleep in the guest room? So heartless. As he spoke, his fingers deftly undid a few buttons of David's shirt. David panicked, grabbing his hand. Where do you want to sleep then? He had a guess, but it felt absurd. Surely not on the first night. I want to sleep with you, obviously. Douglas smiled, looking like a charming demon. Shameless, David thought. No, that's too fast. We can't just. Tonight. He stammered, images flashing through his mind. Douglas laughed, pinning David's hand. What are you thinking, Uncle David? Who said sleeping together means doing anything? I'm just too happy today to sleep alone. He nuzzled David like a puppy. I promise I won't do anything. David didn't believe him for a second. They were both men. He knew exactly what happened when two men got into bed. No, don't push your luck. Before he could argue further, Douglas kissed him again. It was a deep kiss, stealing his breath. Douglas's hands, usually meant for piano or coding, were strong and calloused, sliding under David's shirt. David let out a soft sound, his resistance melting away. Douglas broke the kiss, smoothing David's hair. Uncle David, he negotiated, either let me in the bedroom and I promise to behave, or we consummate this right here on the sofa. He was bluffing, of course. But David, looking like a cornered cat, eventually nodded. Little brat, David muttered. Aye, Douglas agreed cheerfully. Regardless of the process, Douglas ended up in David's bed. They both smelled of the same grapefruit body wash. Lying there, David felt the heat radiating from Douglas like a furnace. It had been years since he shared a bed. It felt crowded, yet strangely intimate. Douglas lay on his side, watching him. What are you looking at? David asked. Just want to look. Douglas pulled David into his arms. They lay close, breaths mingling. Douglas played with David's fingers, recalling the fireworks display where he had secretly held David's pinky. Now, he could hold the whole hand. David checked the time. A few minutes to midnight. Douglas's birthday was almost over. He sat up, pulled open the drawer, and took out the blue box again. I bought this wanting to leave you a memento, David said softly, taking out the Blancpain watch. I thought it had to be expensive to match you. But now, he looked at Douglas in the dim light. I feel like nothing is quite good enough for you. David smiled. You don't need to worry about not matching me yet. I am 13 years older. That's a fact. But one day, you will surpass me. He fastened the watch onto Douglas's wrist. The rose gold looked perfect against his skin. The clock struck 12. Happy birthday, David teased gently. Congratulations on growing up, kid. Douglas pulled David into a fierce hug. I will become a match for you, he vowed. I will become a mature, reliable lover so you never regret choosing me. Okay, David patted his back. I'm waiting. The next morning, they woke up together. Douglas, having no clothes there, put on yesterday's outfit. He knelt to put socks on David's feet, making David startle awake. What are you doing? Breakfast, Douglas announced, standing up. In the kitchen, Douglas donned an apron. The smell of frying eggs and coffee filled the air. David watched him, feeling a sense of domestic peace he had only ever imagined. He helped cut fruit, feeding Douglas a piece of melon. After breakfast, David drove Douglas to the subway station. He wanted to drive him to school, but he was late for the hospital. Go to class. Call me if you need anything, David said, patting Douglas's head like a parent. Douglas checked his watch. He leaned over the gear stick, grabbed David's tie, and pulled him in for a quick, loud kiss. Work hard. I'm your boyfriend now, remember? Douglas got out of the car and waved. David touched his tie, murmuring, reckless, but smiling all the way to the hospital. At school, Douglas slid into his seat just as the bell rang. His roommates, Lucas and George, had saved him a spot. Where were you? Lucas whispered. We waited all day yesterday for your birthday. George and Chris stared at him too. Douglas spun his pen. He couldn't say, I was with your uncle. I was with a friend. What friend? Lucas pressed. Did you go on a date? Douglas paused, then smiled. Yeah. My partner is more important than you guys. Holy shit. The three roommates exclaimed in unison. The professor glared at them. After class, they surrounded him. Who is she? Is she pretty? George asked, eyes wide. Prettier than that actress I like. Douglas laughed. David wasn't a pretty girl. He was a handsome, cold, ascetic man who tasted like sweet wine. Prettier than anyone, Douglas said. You'll meet them. Eventually. Friday arrived. Douglas skipped a dorm dinner to rush to David's villa. When David opened the door, Douglas hugged him immediately. Uncle David, I missed you. Me too, David admitted, hugging back. They cooked dinner together, pepper ribs, stir-fried pork, soup. Domestic bliss. Afterward, David ate strawberry pudding while watching a true crime variety show. Douglas watched David. The way David ate the strawberry, lips stained red, was far more interesting than the murder mystery. Bedtime, David announced at 11. Douglas followed him to the bedroom. This time, he brought a change of clothes and boldly hung them in David's closet. After showering, he found David reading a medical journal on his tablet. Uncle David, Douglas crawled onto the bed, hovering over him. Since you're not sleeping, let's do something else. Don't start, David warned weakly. I'm young and impatient, Douglas grinned, unbuttoning David's pajamas. You're sleeping right next to me. How can I be a saint? He kissed the red mole near David's collarbone. David tried to hide his face, overwhelmed by the sensation. Just then, David's phone rang. It was George. Stop, let me answer, David pleaded. Douglas paused, but didn't move away. David answered, trying to sound normal as George rambled about signing up for a skateboarding class. Douglas, feeling mischievous, bit David's ear. David gasped. What's wrong, Uncle? George asked on the phone. Nothing, David gritted out. He hung up quickly. You. David glared at Douglas, face flushed. My fault, Douglas smiled, pulling the covers over them. Let's continue. The next morning, they were brushing their teeth side by side when footsteps echoed on the stairs. They froze. George walked into the living room, holding a half-eaten cake. Uncle? You're up. David broke into a cold sweat. When did you get back? This morning, George said. Hey, why are Douglas's shoes in the entryway? Before David could invent a lie, Douglas walked down the stairs in a bathrobe, his chest exposed, covered in scratch marks. Uncle David. Douglas started, then saw George. He froze. Morning, Douglas said after a long silence, pulling his robe tight. Morning, George replied, confused. You stayed over? Yeah, Douglas lied smoothly. Stopped by late, crashed here. George bought it. David sighed in relief, retreating to the kitchen. Douglas followed. That was close, Douglas whispered, hugging David from behind. Your fault, David hissed, though he let Douglas hold him. They spent the weekend in a weird limbo, hiding their affection from George. On Sunday, Douglas asked a question before leaving. Uncle David, what if George can't accept us? David was stunned. He will. I hope so, Douglas said, hugging him. But consider keeping it a secret a bit longer. Christmas arrived. David was at a bar with friends when he realized the date. His friends mocked him for being single. He realized Douglas had asked him out, and he had refused to make him study. I have a date, David announced, leaving his stunned friends. He drove to Douglas's university. He called Douglas. Where are you? Douglas asked. Outside your school, David said. Douglas ran out to the car. They kissed in the cold air. David produced a box of chocolates. I missed the Christmas dance in college, so I'm giving you chocolates now. Douglas laughed and produced a gift too, a scarf, and his own box of chocolates. If I were your junior in college, I would have chased you then. They kissed again by the wall. Suddenly, a sound of something dropping made them jump. They looked over. George stood there, a bag of snacks spilled on the ground, jaw dropped. Douglas! George screamed. You're bullying my uncle. George, David called out calmly. George froze. Get in the car, David said. We're going home. The ride was silent. At home, David sat them down. We are dating, David said simply. I like him. It's not a joke. George looked like his world had collapsed. But you liked girls before. People change, David said. George cried. David wiped his tears. You don't have to accept it immediately. But don't make me wait too long. George sniffled. I need time. He marched to his room, then paused. Wait. Where is Douglas sleeping? He realized with horror that Douglas was sleeping in his uncle's room. That night, Douglas and David lay in bed. He'll come around, David said. I'm just glad you didn't hide it, Douglas kissed him. 2 days later, George cornered Douglas in the kitchen. You better treat him well. He's old. I mean, he needs care. Douglas laughed. I will. And, George whispered, looking pained, I guess I won't have cousins. Since, you can't give birth. Douglas dropped the spatula. You think I'm the wife, aren't you? George asked innocently. Get out, Douglas said. Winter break came. Douglas prepared to go home for the Lunar New Year, though he knew his family wouldn't welcome him. If they kick you out, run, David joked, but his eyes were worried. I will, Douglas promised. On New Year's Eve, David called Douglas. Where are you? At home, Douglas lied. Eating dinner. But David heard the silence in the background. Turn on the video. Douglas hesitated, then switched it on. The background was a hotel room. David's face darkened. Send me the location. David, it's late. Don't. Send it. David packed a bag. He told his parents. I'm going to get someone important. His father, sensing everything, let him go. David drove 4 hours through the snowy night. When he arrived at the hotel room, Douglas opened the door, looking shocked. I knew you were coming, Douglas whispered. David hugged him tight. I'm here. They tumbled onto the bed, desperate and in love. I missed you, Douglas said against his skin. I know, David replied. Let's go home tomorrow. They spent the rest of the holiday in the hotel, visiting Douglas's old high school, eating at his favorite spots. On the drive back to David's villa, the snow had stopped. They walked into the empty house. It was quiet, smelling of home. Welcome home, David said, kissing him. Douglas smiled, holding David's hand. He had found his place.